Alright, so I actually got a little bit of good news here for you guys. Seems like a rare occasion on this channel, but yesterday we had some pretty massive dubs in Wisconsin, in Chicago, Illinois, and obviously we also had the Trump arraignment that was taking place, which was honestly just entertaining as fuck. But here to start us off with the specifics on what I'm going to be focusing on in this video, we have the Chicago mayoral race, and as pointed out here by Charlie Kirk, he says Trump arraigned, Marxist wins mayoral race in Chicago. Absolutely love to see it. And Democrats flip the Supreme Court in Wisconsin. Very bad day. No spin, no BS. Country is in collapse. We need God and dutiful action. Okay, so when Charlie Kirk is mad, you know that it's going to be a good day. Okay, we also had this aspect specifically with the Chicago race, where apparently we had multiple, members within the Chicago police force that were threatening to resign if Brandon Johnson, this leftist, ended up winning. And, I guess if the, police unions, if Charlie Kirk are all rallying against you, it's probably a pretty good endorsement, at least a pretty good sign. And so we end up with these results here from the New York Times. They say Brandon Johnson has successfully won the Chicago mayoral race in Illinois with 286,000 votes, roughly 51.4%, to Paul Vallis, who is an absolute demon, and we'll get to that here in a second, losing with 270,000 votes, which is roughly 48.6%. Okay, so now a little bit more details in terms of who both of these guys are and why it's such an important, piece of information that Brandon Johnson ended up getting the dub in the situation. So from Common Dreams, Jake Johnson, he says, Progressive Cook County Commissioner Brandon Johnson defeated conservative Democrat and school privatizer Paul Vallis in Chicago's mayoral runoff on Tuesday, a victory that he called a gateway to a new future for the nation's third largest city. Okay, so this guy Paul Vallis, as they point out here, number one, it seems like his main priority, at least throughout his career, has basically been focused on trying to privatize school systems. He did this in, I think, Philadelphia as well as New Orleans, with just absolutely disastrous results for those different cities, and just trying to funnel money upwards to himself, his buddies, and basically strip resources from some of the most underfunded school districts in the entire country. So that's who he is. It seems like that played a pretty significant role directly in this election, as Brandon Johnson was standing opposed to his school privatization and gutting of public schools and trying to bolster charter schools, and Brandon was actually focused on trying to increase funding and increasing the resources that would be given to some of these Chicago public schools. But we got a quote here from Johnson. He says, "Tonight is the beginning of a Chicago that truly invests in all of its people," he said in his victory speech, pledging to usher in a city that actually represents the workers who keep it running, and one where public schools have the resources to meet the needs of every child. And they give a little bit more details here on Brandon Johnson. They say a former public school teacher and a longtime union organizer, again, absolutely based, you love to see it. They say Johnson vowed to prioritize investments in public education and oppose charter expansions, an agenda that couldn't have contrasted more sharply with that of Vallis, the former CEO of Chicago Public Schools and an ardent supporter of school privatization. I mean, just think about that just for 1 second. The CEO, the Chief Executive Officer of Chicago Public Schools. Seems like that might be just an inherent problem with the structure of how we go about funding education in this country, that you have a CEO of the Chicago Public Schools, not like a superintendent or anything like that, just a CEO who is essentially focused on, again, stripping resources from these public schools and shoveling that off to private enterprises. But they say that Vallis, by contrast, whose campaign was backed by Republican donors and business interests, aggressively pursued school privatization schemes during his tenure as the head of school districts in Chicago, New Orleans, and Philadelphia, notably Chicago. Again, this is a guy who basically helped to destroy the public school system within Chicago and employed incredibly draconian policies for some of the students who were, attending some of these schools in Chicago as well as in New Orleans and Philadelphia, and basically, again, tried to privatize them, tried to strip them of resources to the detriment of the actual working class people who live within these various communities. But They say that this is a record that Johnson's campaign spotlighted in an ad that aired earlier this week, as well as in debates ahead of Tuesday's vote. And they say that Maurice Mitchell, a national director for the Working Families Party, which was aggressively in support of Brandon Johnson, said in a statement late Tuesday that Chicago's runoff marks a win for the history books, and says that Brandon Johnson just defeated a deluge of far-right money and misinformation thanks to the people power and his positive vision for a safe and thriving Chicago. And she added, now comes the hard work of building a Chicago for the many, with strong schools, good jobs, and safe communities. And then she added, we look forward to working with Brandon and the new class of Working Families Alder members to reopen mental health clinics, pass universal health care, and implement a local Green New Deal. I couldn't ask for a better agenda if I honestly tried to. Okay, so this guy seems like he is going to be a great mayor of Chicago, especially in a city where, again, people have been subjected to unnecessary austerity at the hands of corporate-backed candidates. It seems like this is genuinely going to be a monumental shift. And keep in mind, this guy, Brandon Johnson, he was nowhere close to being the expected winner here. Okay, we had sort of this race that was undergoing with Lori Lightfoot, the previous mayor of Chicago, Brandon Johnson, Paul Vallis, I think a couple of other ones. And Johnson was honestly the underdog of underdogs, and he managed to work his way up and actually push forward with a broad, multiracial working class agenda that clearly was appealing to the people of Chicago. So they say in contrast to Vallis, whose campaign was also backed by a super PAC with close ties to former Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, who is just an utter enemy to public education. I mean, literally under the Trump administration, wanted to essentially gut the Department of Education and put it on its knees. And they say the bulk of Johnson's support came from unions such as the American Federation of Teachers, the AFT, and the Chicago Teachers Union. Okay, so being a former union organizer himself, not surprising that the unions would back him, but, this gives us an indication in terms of not only the economic benefits of unions, but also the political benefits of having this sort of broad, organized working class movement where you can actually end up overpowering some of the massive amounts of super PAC money and billionaire money and right-wing money that is coming into some of these races, right? I mean, these unions really made the difference within this race, not only with the, financial support, but also with the organizational support that they gave to Brandon Johnson. So Johnson says, make no mistake about it, Chicago is a union town. And then we also got a statement here from Stacey Davis Gates, the president of the CTU, who said, today Chicago has spoken, and that Chicago has said yes to hope, yes to investment in people, yes to housing the unhoused, and yes to supporting young people with fully funded schools. It is a new day in our city. And they say that AFT President Randy Weingarten called Johnson's win, quote, a transformational moment that sends a message that efforts to exploit anxiety will not work in the face of a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-generational working class movement standing together as one. And another thing that Paul Vallis was apparently trying to really hammer home on was like this rampant crime wave that's taking place all across the United States because our precious police officers were defunded and all of this good stuff, right? And clearly that, this election is a message that is not necessarily going to work, and that people who have actual alternatives to just jacking up police budgets, giving them more military equipment, flooding the streets with more cops, people who have actual solutions in terms of investing in poor communities, in terms of reinvesting some of the money that we give to the police in those communities, that is actually appealing, right? I mean, we heard all of this fucking hoopla during the 2020 election, especially that defund the police, oh, it's such an unpopular slogan and all this and that. But it's like when you actually explain it to people and you actually run a campaign, focus on improving people's just basic fundamental economic reality, then yes, they understand that we need resources to be put in different places in order to address these problems in the long run. And clearly it ended up working out for Johnson in this case. So they say that Johnson's upset win Tuesday capped off a remarkable rise for a progressive lawmaker who was polling at just over 3% just a couple months ago in December. And at that time, according to one survey, Vallis was polling at 19%, so had a massive lead over Johnson. Again, a dramatic underdog in this election here. But they say in January, Chicago's outgoing mayor, Lori Lightfoot, brushed aside the CTU's endorsement of Johnson, saying, quote, Brandon Johnson isn't going to be the mayor of this city. Eat your fucking words, Lori Lightfoot. And we got a response here from Brandon. He says, they said that this would never happen. If they didn't know, now they know. Okay, so again, you love to see it. I got a couple more things that I'll link down in the description if you want to just get a little bit more background in terms of who Paul Vallas was and who Brandon Johnson is and how he's trying to fight for working class communities within Chicago. There's a great video, as usual, that was put together here by More Perfect Union that will be in the description. It's about 10 minutes long if you want to go watch the entirety of it, but again, just a basic synopsis. They run through the history of Paul Vallas in multiple different cities across the United States, whether it's Chicago, New Orleans, Philadelphia. There was another city in Connecticut that he was also basically in charge of gutting their public education systems and implementing full-scale like neoliberal privatization measures that were again absolutely disastrous for the average working class people living within these cities. And so you can go watch this video down in the description. Again, highly recommend it. And then I'll also link below his basically his policy list, his main core tenets of what he was running on during this campaign, because you can get an insight in terms of how to actually push back against some of the corporate power that tends to dominate in these types of elections, especially in large cities like Chicago, and not only on the political front, but also get an idea of what he's going to be fighting for in the immediate future. So there you have it. Absolutely amazing news coming out of Chicago. I'll do another video tomorrow where I'm breaking down sort of the inner workings of the Wisconsin Supreme Court election, which was probably the most important election of this entire year. So I'll do that tomorrow, but today we can just stand happy. We got a couple dubs on the board here from the left, and honestly, I'm just excited to see what Brandon Johnson is going to be able to do in Chicago.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying